Hello, and welcome to ELA Plus, your free supplemental guide to the English language arts. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. In today's video lesson, we're going to introduce you to William Shakespeare's sonnets. Shakespeare's sonnets are the first poems we're going to read and analyze here on the channel, and for good reason. First, these poems are of tremendous literary and linguistic richness, masterful showcases of poetic form and literary device. Also, studying these poems equips students with the requisite literary skills necessary for further English language arts studies. Finally, familiarity with these poems, especially memorizing them, is a pretty cool party trick to make you look like the sophisticate you are. And what better reason is there than that to study Shakespeare? This introduction to William Shakespeare's sonnets consists of 6 parts. In the first part, you'll learn about what the sonnets are and how you should go about reading them. Then we'll talk a little bit about the publication history and the writing history of the poems. After that, we'll discuss what I like to call the Dramatis Personae. Along with the Dramatis Personae, there's also going to be talk about the dramatic arc that the cycle follows. Importantly, we'll also discuss the themes that you should be looking for as you read the poems. Then we'll talk about some notes on the text. After that, we're going to get into what I like to call the happy hunting ground. And finally, we'll conclude with some comprehension questions. All right then, let's get to it. So right off the bat, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. These are difficult poems to understand, notoriously difficult. Shakespeare's sonnets are like the Calc 1 and Calc 2 of your English language arts studies. Only instead of grinding your way to an understanding of limits, derivatives, and integrals, you're going to be racking your mind over such things as ambiguous metaphor, dated cultural references, and what, if anything, the dateless lively heat of Cupid's brand has to do with sexual contact and venereal disease. But don't let this difficulty dissuade you from studying these great poems. Though maybe do let Sonnet 153 dissuade you from engaging in other collegiate probings. Really, you should not be discouraged from reading and studying these great poems. First and foremost, because Shakespeare's sonnets are among the greatest poems written in our English language. I mean, there's a reason we've been reading and studying them for so long now. And ELA Plus is going to be here for you through every single one of them. We're going to read and analyze all 154 of these poems. The instruction starts here in this video. The first thing you need to know is that Shakespeare's sonnets are what's called a sonnet cycle. A sonnet cycle is a collection of sonnets that are thematically linked and when read together produce a cohesive poetic work. In Shakespeare's sonnets, there are 154 of them. For an in-depth look into what a sonnet is, please see our video lesson, Introduction to the English Sonnet. I'm going to link to that down in the description. You should check it out. But in a nutshell, a sonnet is a 14-line poem written in iambic pentameter and with a set rhyme scheme. Again, we get very deep into what a sonnet is, its history, the different formats that poets use to write it in English, and you can watch that in the video lesson, Introduction to the English Sonnet. Check it out. But for now, that's all you need to know. Shakespeare's sonnets are a sonnet cycle of 154 sonnets. How these immortal poems came to be written and first published, however, is an interesting story all to itself. Theories abound, but the general consensus is that these 154 poems were written roughly between 1592 and 1604. What we do know for certain is that Shakespeare's sonnets was first published in 1609 by one Thomas Thorpe. This is the edition now known famously as the Quarto, or Q. No original manuscript of the sonnets survive, so the Quarto is the earliest version that we have, though we do know that a few of the poems were published previous to the Quarto, and also that Shakespeare distributed some of these poems to his close friends before the Quarto's publication. It should also be noted that we don't know if Shakespeare exercised any authorial command over the publication of these poems. That is to say, it's unknowable whether the sequence that we read them in today is the sequence that Shakespeare himself intended for them to be read. This is a very important fact to consider because the Quarto's arrangements of the sonnets remains how we read them today, and the way in which they are arranged show a very clear, I would say, dramatic arc. So the sequence in which the Quarto arranged these poems therefore has a profound impact on how we read them, ever since 1609. Let's take a look at this organization. The first thing I draw a novice reader's attention to are the so-called characters of the sonnets. Remember that Shakespeare is primarily a playwright, and I believe that this dramatic inclination leaked into his poetry, particularly in the sonnets. So we might call these characters the Dramatis Personae. And there are 4 of them: the speaker, the young man, the dark lady, and the rival poet. We'll start with the speaker, as he appears in every single one of these poems. The speaker is the voice of the sonnets. Many critics, since the Romantic period, have come to associate the speaker with Shakespeare himself. Under this theory, not only is the author Shakespeare, but all of the ideas are wholly personal, and so the sonnets become inherently autobiographical in nature. This is, in my view, mistaken. Many disagree with me on this point, and their opinions are informed and considered and well worth looking into, especially if you want to explore this aspect of the sonnets yourself. But I still think they're wrong, and I think they're wrong for at least 2 reasons. First, as I said earlier, Shakespeare was a dramatist, so his creative powers are perfectly capable of conjuring a first-person narrator so convincing so as to be misidentified with the author himself. Secondly, when thinking about the sonnets, it's very important to consider the context in which they were written, and they were written within the context of the patronage system. As Jonathan Bate writes in his book The Genius of Shakespeare, there was a major vogue for sonnet writing in the 1590s to get literary patronage. So, under this context, it becomes reasonable to assume that sonnet writers are not necessarily writing for personal expression, but rather to gain literary patronage. One point in favor of this perspective is that the Earl of Southampton, a man known today as being a patron of William Shakespeare, was opposed to marriage. Keep this fact in mind as we move forward through the Dramatis Personae and our discussion of the themes and organizational principles of the sonnets. The idea here is that we should not be so quick to assume that these sonnets were written as a wholly personal expressive endeavor. Yes, Shakespeare drew upon his personal experience and his feelings, but it's probably not the case that these sonnets are autobiographical in nature. As Jonathan Bate writes, "What then about the love life of Shakespeare himself? Rowe and his successors among the 18th century Shakespeareans did not take much interest in the question. It certainly did not occur to them to seek in the plays for hidden clues to Shakespeare's amorous inclinations. They did not regard literature as encoded autobiography. This was an idea that only emerged towards the end of the century, and which was at the center of the great cultural shift that we call the Romantic movement. The point is critical, and a failure to grasp it has done more than anything else to create misconceptions and myths about Shakespeare." This is all to say that the speaker should not be associated with William Shakespeare himself. And that brings us to the next character in these poems, the young man. The young man is a major character in the sonnets. In fact, the speaker directly addresses the young man in 126 of the 154 sonnets. Note how I said the first 126 sonnets. Remember that we don't know if Shakespeare intended for us to read the sonnets in the fashion that we read them today, but according to the Quarto, it certainly appears that the first 126 poems are addressed to a single character, and that character is the young man. It's true that not every single one of these 126 poems explicitly addresses the young man, but there's enough of a sustained fictional presence and similarity of address between the speaker and the young man so as to justify the fact that these 126 poems are indeed addressed to the young man. And this may be the single most surprising thing about Shakespeare's sonnets to a new reader. Most of them were written for a male. In fact, most of the sonnets that you're probably familiar with, the ones that you typically associate with being about romantic love, were written with a male for the subject. I'm sure you've heard the line, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" And when you did hear it, you probably thought that this was written by a male for a female, but that's incorrect. This poem was written by a male for a male. This fact has provoked all manner of speculation about William Shakespeare's sexuality. Critics in the 20th and 21st century have argued, with varying textual support, that Shakespeare was a homosexual or that the sonnets are of a homoerotic persuasion. I'm unconvinced by these arguments. A discussion of this particular topic falls outside the ambit of this simple introduction video, but just know that we will get into this topic more in depth as we discuss the individual sonnets themselves. For now, I'll just leave you with the thoughts of Stephen Booth, a noted Shakespeare scholar and editor of his sonnets. William Shakespeare was almost certainly homosexual, bisexual, or heterosexual. The sonnets provide no evidence on the matter. Our next character is the Dark Lady. The Dark Lady is addressed by the speaker in sonnets 127 through 152. The dark in the Dark Lady is believed to refer to either her physical appearance, her eyes, her hair, her complexion, or to her great moral and emotional complexity. Dark indeed. These poems are tumultuous. The Dark Lady sonnets depict a very passionate and problematic love affair with great emotional complexity. The Dark Lady is a very captivating and seductive character for the speaker, and his relationship with her is one of disordered desire and profound inner emotional turmoil. That brings us to our final character, the rival poet. We're not going to spend too much time on the rival poet because he's a minor character compared to the Dark Lady and the young man and the speaker, but just know that he appears in the poems 78 through 86, and he provokes great feelings of jealousy in the speaker. And the source of this jealousy is that the rival poet gains the attention of the young man, and this provokes all manner of emotion in the speaker. Now that we've met the characters, we can move on to discussing the plot of the sonnets. Now, I use the term plot very loosely because there's not a strict plot like there is in the 5-act structure that Shakespeare uses in his plays, but as you read these poems, you're going to find that there is a dramatic arc that emerges from the reading. As you can see here, the first section is commonly referred to as the procreation sonnets. The procreation sonnets are 17 sonnets, and in them, the speaker addresses the young man, tells him that he needs to settle down, find a woman, and procreate so he can pass on his beauty to future generations. And here's where it's important to remember our discussion of the Earl of Southampton. That man was staunchly opposed to marriage. So, within the context of the patronage system, Shakespeare would have written these poems specifically for the Earl of Southampton so as to gain his patronage. This supports our theory that these poems are not necessarily autobiographical in nature. They were written more to gain literary patronage. In the next set of sonnets, numbers 18 through 26, the speaker abandons his project of getting the young man to settle down, find a woman, and procreate. Instead, what happens is the speaker starts to experience very profound and intense emotions for the young man. He frets over the young man's beauty and his love for him and their friendship together. Even more so than in the first 17 sonnets, though, he starts to worry about the ravages of time's all-consuming waste. The speaker's desire now is that he's got to find another way to preserve the young man's beauty, because procreation just will not cut it. The young man, the speaker decides, will not gain immortality through procreation. He'll gain immortality through his immortalization and the speaker's immortal poetry. Well, it's been 400 years, so, the speaker's not wrong yet. In sonnets 27 through 101, the bulk of the cycle, this intensity of emotion continues to build, and feelings of insecurity start to emerge for the speaker as he thinks about the young man. At one point, the young man cheats somehow the speaker, or does him wrong in some way. This ensnares the speaker in an absolute fit of jealousy and anger and self-doubt and frustration. The poems in this section are poems of tremendous emotional upheaval. When you hear people say that the sonnets of Shakespeare are a treasure trove of human wisdom and emotion, they're probably referring to one of the poems in this section. In the concluding portion of the young man's sonnets, the speaker starts to chill out a little bit. This occurs in sonnets 102 through 126. He forgives the young man for any transgressions the young man may have committed, and the speaker also apologizes to the young man for being cold to him. And that brings us to the Dark Lady sonnets. The general scholarly consensus is that the sonnets can be divided into two parts: the young man sonnets, sonnets 1 through 126, and the Dark Lady sonnets, sonnets 127 through 154. Don't be fooled by the numerical inferiority of the Dark Lady sonnets. These punch way above their weight class. These are crazy poems. After all, the Dark Lady sonnets treat a tumultuous, passionate sexual relationship, and sexual relationships are much more interesting than the mere friendship relationship. The speaker, he runs the gamut here. The Dark Lady is beauty personified. No, she's outstandingly ugly. She's an angel. No, she's a demon. These are poems of obsession and rage, a complex weaving of romantic bliss and destructive jealousy and shame. You're going to like these. Well, there are only two more sonnets left, Sonnet 153 and Sonnet 154. Most scholars, as I just said, lump these two sonnets in with the Dark Lady sonnets, but I like to call these sonnets the Cupid sonnets because they're different and it appears that the Dark Lady may not be under consideration anymore. The thesis of these two poems is quite simple. Sexual love will burn you. This is a piece of eternal wisdom, the most recent variation of which is presented in the works of Russell Tyrone Jones and his magisterial introduction to Return to the 36 Chambers, which I would suggest any student pair with a reading of Shakespeare's sonnets. The pitfalls of sexual passion is just one of the many themes that are introduced in this sonnet cycle. We're not going to get too deep into the themes right now because we're going to have plenty of time for that when we treat each individual sonnet. But for now, what I want you to do is just keep these themes in your mind as you start your own reading. Okay, so we got love, time and mortality, beauty, friendship, jealousy, sexuality and desire, moral and ethical concerns, art and immortality, ambiguity and paradox, individual identity, and nature and artifice. Now, it's very important when discussing the works of William Shakespeare to consider the role of the editor. And the reason I say that is this. Remember, Shakespeare was writing a very long time ago, during the English Renaissance. That was way back in the 16th and early 17th centuries, and a lot has changed in the English language since then. Spelling, punctuation, even grammar has changed. So the role of the editor then becomes very important because the editor needs to bring that language into the 21st century. And this is achieved through the process of emendation. To amend a text is to alter or change the text. In this short section, I'm going to provide 3 examples of Sonnet 148. The Quarto edition, the Norton Shakespeare edition, and Stephen Booth's edition. And then I'm going to provide a reason for why ELA Plus will use Stephen Booth's edition. Here we see 3 different versions of the text of Sonnet 148. Comparing these 3 different texts of the same poem, we find the most differences between the original Quarto edition and the 2 modern emendated editions. Let's look first at the Quarto edition. Here's the Quarto edition, and I want you to look very closely at it. The English that you find here is early modern English. The differences between early modern English and the contemporary English that we see in written form today is quite striking. Most students will see the differences right away. The differences are found in the letters UV, IJ, and in the long S. All 3 examples are found here in Sonnet 148. In the first line, we find a perfect example of early modern English's use of the letters UV. Go ahead and read the line. O me, what eyes hath love put in my head? You'll see that the letter V in the word love is presented as a U, but the letter U in the word put is presented just like we'd see the letter U today. This is not an error of the typesetter. This follows established rules for printing in early modern English. The rule is that the V sound will be typed as the letter U if it appears in the middle of a word, and as a V if it appears at the beginning of a word. So we see the letter U printed for love in line 1, and the letter V printed for the same sound in the word vexed in line 10. Think of it like this. We have 2 different shapes for the same letter, and their usage depends on the placement of the letter within the word. We find similar conventions for the letters I and J in early modern English. Go ahead and look at the word judgment in line 3. Doesn't it look like the J is written as an I? Well, it does look like that because it is written like that. And the rule is that if the sound J appears at the beginning of a word, it's printed as an I. But if the sound J appears at the end of a word, then it's printed with the letter J that we understand today. Perhaps the most striking oddity that we find in early modern English is the use of the long S and the short S. Here are the rules. The long S is presented as the letter F. So F is going to be printed for the sound that S makes if that letter appears at the beginning or in the middle of a word. The short S is going to be printed as we would read the S today, that is the letter S, if it appears at the end of the word. So what you want to do is look at line 12 for a bevy of examples. The sun itself sees not till heaven clears. Here we find the long S, the letter F, in the word sun, in the word self, and in the word sees. But we see the short S, that is the letter S that we know, in the word sees and also clears. And that's because, as the rule dictates, that S sound appears at the end of the word. Another obvious distinction between early modern English and contemporary English is spelling. Look at the word marvel in line 11. In early modern English, we see it spelled M-A-R-V-A-I-L-E. In contemporary English, obviously, we spell the word marvel M-A-R-V-E-L. Other examples abound. Don't be thrown off by them if, you dedicated lunatic, you read the original quarto edition in your Shakespeare studies. We also see that there are various emendations between the modern editions of the sonnets. Let's compare the Norton Shakespeare with the Booth Shakespeare. Here we see a few editorial differences. In the first line, for instance, we see that the Norton spells the word O, O-H, and has a comma between O and me, whereas the Booth spells the word O with just O and with no comma. Booth, likewise, does not capitalize the W in the word what, but Norton does. There are a few differences in punctuation as well. The Norton ends the second line with a question mark, Booth with an exclamation point. Feel free to identify other differing editorial decisions between these two editions in the comments. Think about why different editors may make different emendations, and let me know what you think. As for me, after careful consideration of different texts, I've decided to go with the Booth emendations. In my opinion, Stephen Booth's Shakespeare Sonnets is the best edition to purchase for study of these poems. He has the richest notes and commentary, and his editorial decisions, I think, are the best on offer. I can't put it better than Booth himself, so I'll conclude this section on the textual editorial decisions of the sonnets with a passage from the preface he wrote for his book. Both my text and my commentary are determined by what I think a Renaissance reader would have thought as he moved from line to line and sonnet to sonnet in the quarto. I make no substantial emendations and a few minor ones. It might therefore seem reasonable to reprint the quarto text alone and simply comment on that. But the effect of almost 4 centuries are such that a modern reader faced with the quarto text sees something that is effectively very different from what a 17th century reader saw. And now we enter the happy hunting grounds. I named this section after a passage from James Joyce's Ulysses where one character claims that Shakespeare is the happy hunting ground of all minds that have lost their balance. What I think the character is getting at is that Shakespeare's work is so rich and so profound and so polysemous that there is no limit to the amount of interpretation that can be engaged with in his work. That is certainly the case with the sonnets. These sonnets have provoked all manner of speculation and theories. The quarto dedication page alone has spilled untold amounts of ink over what it could possibly mean. Further, entire books, entire libraries are filled with theories as to who the young man is, or who the dark lady is, or who the rival poet is, or who the speaker is. We've seen some of this speculation and theory here in this introduction. Are the sonnets read as personal autobiographical confessions, or as a writer merely trying to gain literary patronage? Are the young man sonnets evidence of Shakespeare's homosexuality, or are they dramatic renderings of Renaissance-era male friendship? The debate isn't settled by any means, but sides are being taken. I encourage you to take up a side or stake out a position on these poems. It's open season here in the happy hunting grounds. In order to get your thinking started, I'm going to leave you with some comprehension questions that you can answer down in the comments below, based on the material that we learned in this video lesson. Number 1, what is a sonnet? Number 2, how many sonnets are in the Shakespeare sonnet cycle? Number 3, who are the Dramatis Personae of the sonnet cycle? Number 4, describe the organization of the sonnets, the sequence in which they're presented. Number 5, what are some of the major themes that appear in William Shakespeare's sonnets? Number 6, What does emendation mean? Provide an example from the collection. And number 7, have you already read the sonnets? If so, do you have any that stick out for you? What are your favorites? This concludes the ELA Plus Introduction to William Shakespeare Sonnets. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from it. If you did, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. Also consider sharing it with friends, fellow students, and your English language teacher or professor. If you have any questions about this video or other questions about your English language arts studies in school, please don't hesitate to ask down in the comments. I'm available, and I'll do my very best to offer high-quality answers to anything you might want to know. Remember that ELA Plus is a free, regularly updated supplemental guide to the English language arts. Subscribe to learn more. Until our next lesson, keep reading, get obsessed, and take care of yourselves and others. Thank you.